The wind carried a sound that no living creature should ever have to hear. It was the cry of mothers who had lost their children, a haunting melody that bounced off the crystalline peaks of Valdrex Prime and echoed across the frozen valleys below. The albino dragons circled above their nesting grounds in tight formation, their massive wings beating in synchronized sorrow. Each pass over the rookery brought fresh waves of grief that rippled through the colony like tremors through stone. The Valdren had lived on these mountains for thousands of years. They were an old species, ancient even by galactic standards, with memories that stretched back before most civilizations had learned to build fires. Their white scales weren't just beautiful, they were a mark of pride, a symbol of purity that set them apart from every other dragon species in the known universe. These weren't simple beasts. They had language, culture, and traditions that had been passed down through countless generations. They built with crystal and stone, carved history into the mountain faces, and believed deeply that their isolation kept them strong. Elder Kerwesesthal flew at the head of the morning formation. She was massive even among her own kind, with scales that gleamed like fresh snow under the pale sun. Her wings, each one broader than a human spacecraft, cut through the thin mountain air with practiced ease. She had led her people for 3 centuries and had seen many things in her long life. But she had never seen anything like this. Below her, the rookery was silent. That silence was worse than any scream. The nesting ground should have been filled with the gentle humming of eggs about to hatch, the soft chittering sounds that young dragons made as they prepared to break free from their shells. Instead, there was nothing. Just the cold wind whistling through empty nests and over shells that had turned from translucent white to a dull, lifeless gray. 37 eggs. An entire generation. Gone. The cold snap had come 3 nights ago, sweeping down from the northern peaks without any warning. The weather patterns on Valdrex Prime had been stable for millennia. The Valdren had studied them, understood them, built their entire nesting cycle around the predictable seasons. This kind of freeze wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not during hatching season. The temperature had dropped so fast and so far that even the warming stones the dragons had placed around each nest couldn't compensate. By morning, when the mothers had returned from their hunting flights, it was already too late. Kerwesesthal had examined each egg herself, hoping against hope that her ancient knowledge might reveal some spark of life. But dragon eggs were fragile things despite their hard shells. The embryos inside needed precise conditions to develop. Too much cold and their delicate system simply stopped. She had pressed her ear against shell after shell, listening for heartbeats that would never come. The Valdren had no allies to turn to in this moment. That was by choice. For centuries they had watched other species join the Galactic Union, forming alliances and trading partnerships. Ambassadors had come to Valdrex Prime with offers of membership, promises of shared technology and mutual protection. Each time the Valdren had refused. They saw themselves as superior, set apart by their age and their traditions. Why would they need others? They had survived for millennia on their own. They needed no one. Now, as Kerwesesthal looked down at the empty nests, that proud isolation felt different. It felt like loneliness. It felt like a mistake. But pride was a hard thing to swallow, especially for a species that had built its entire identity on independence. The other dragons in her colony looked to her for answers, for guidance, for some kind of hope. She had none to give them. The sky was darkening now, not with the natural fall of night but with something far more ominous. On the horizon, clouds were building into a massive wall of churning gray and purple. Lightning flickered deep within the formation, not the normal kind but something else. Electromagnetic discharges that made the air taste like metal. The Valdren knew this phenomenon well. It was a maelstrom, a storm that would blanket the mountains for weeks, cutting them off from the lower valleys with winds that could tear wings and lightning that could burn scales. The colony would be trapped here with their grief and their empty nests. No hunting parties could venture out. No contact with the outside world. Just the mountains, the cold, and the memories of what they had lost. Kerwesesthal called out to her people, a low rumbling command that brought the morning flight to an end. One by one, the dragons descended toward their caves, seeking shelter before the storm arrived. The elder remained airborne a moment longer, taking one last look at the rookery below. Somewhere in her ancient heart, she felt something she had never truly felt before. Helplessness. Complete and utter helplessness. The storm was coming and they would face it alone. The storm hit like a hammer from hell. One moment, Captain Jake Morrison was running a routine supply drop to the mining colonies on the outer rim. The next, his navigation systems were screaming warnings as electromagnetic interference tore through every circuit on his ship. The viewport lit up with violet lightning that seemed to reach out and grab his vessel like an angry god's hand. Jake had been flying cargo runs for 12 years. He'd survived engine failures, pirate attacks, and a meteor strike that had left a hole the size of his fist in the hull. But he'd never seen anything like this. The storm wrapped around his ship like a living thing, pulling him down toward the planet below. His instruments showed nothing but static. The autopilot was dead. Manual controls barely responded. He fought the descent for as long as he could, but physics doesn't care about determination. The ship tore through the atmosphere at an angle that would have made any flight instructor weep. Jake managed to fire the emergency thrusters at the last second, turning what would have been a crater into merely a catastrophic crash. The vessel hit the lower slopes of a mountain range, carving a burning scar through snow that was deeper than Jake had ever seen. The impact knocked him unconscious. When he came to, everything hurt and his ship was dying around him. Sparks rained from shorted circuits. The hull groaned like a wounded animal. Frost was already forming on the inside of the broken viewport. Jake's breath came out in clouds of white vapor. The temperature readout on his suit said -40 and dropping fast. He didn't have time to think about how bad this was. Thinking got you killed in situations like this. Action kept you alive. Jake grabbed his emergency kit and whatever survival gear he could carry. The ship's medical supplies, the whole reason for this run, were in sealed containers that had somehow survived the crash. He couldn't carry all of them, but he strapped what he could to his back. Maybe someone would need them. Maybe he would. Getting out of the wreckage was its own nightmare. The main hatch was jammed, so Jake had to crawl through a gap in the hull that left tears in his thermal suit. Not big tears, but enough. In this cold, enough was all it took. He stumbled out into a world of white and wind and cold that bit through his gear like it was made of paper. The Valdran sentries saw him almost immediately. They perched on rocky outcrops high above, watching this small figure struggle through snow that came up to his chest. They had posted warnings around their territory in every major language. Keep out. No trespassing. We want no contact with outsiders. This human, like others before him, had clearly ignored those warnings. The storm would take care of him soon enough. It always did. But Jake Morrison wasn't planning on dying today. He found a sheltered spot against a rock formation and set up his emergency habitat. The thermal generator sputtered to life, creating a bubble of warmth in the freezing hell around him. He sealed the tears in his suit as best he could. He rationed his food and water. And then he waited. The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of wind that sounded like screaming. 3 days of lightning that turned the world purple and white. 3 days where the cold tried its best to find every weakness in his shelter, every gap in his defenses. Jake kept the generator running, repaired what broke, and refused to give up. That was the thing about humans, they were stubborn in ways that didn't always make sense. Another species might have accepted their fate. Jake just kept fixing things and staying alive out of spite. On the 3rd day, the wind finally calmed enough for Jake to step outside. His supplies were running low. His generator was on its last power cell. But when he looked up the mountain, he saw something that changed everything. Structures. Not natural formations, but carved buildings built into the mountainside. And beyond them, something that made his medic's heart clench, a rookery. He recognized it from xenobiology training. Nesting grounds? But something was wrong. Even from this distance, Jake could see the stillness. Nesting grounds should be bustling with activity. This one looked abandoned. Empty. His medical instincts kicked in before his survival instincts could stop him. Jake started climbing. Not down toward safety and the slim chance of rescue, but up. Toward the settlement. Toward whatever disaster had happened there. His rational mind told him this was insane. He was injured, low on supplies, and these aliens had made it clear they wanted no contact. But Jake had taken an oath a long time ago. Do no harm. Help where you can. The species of the patient doesn't matter. By the time Elder Carousel flew down to investigate this strange human who was climbing toward their home instead of fleeing from it, Jake had made it halfway up the mountain. He was exhausted, frostbitten, and should have been dead 3 times over. But he was still moving. The dragon landed in front of him, massive and white and terrifying. Her scales caught the dim sunlight like polished bone. Her eyes were ancient and filled with grief and suspicion. This was a being that could end him with one swipe of her claws. Jake knew that. He didn't care. He pulled out his battered communicator and waited for it to translate. When it finally worked, his first words were simple and true. I'm a medic. I saw your rookery from above. Can I help? The dragon stared at him like he'd just spoken in a language that didn't exist. And maybe he had. Maybe the language of offering help to strangers during your darkest hour was something the Valdren had forgotten existed. The great crystalline chamber had stood for 10,000 years. It was carved from a single massive formation that grew naturally from the mountain's heart, with walls that caught light and split it into rainbow patterns across the floor. The Valdren Council met here only for the most important decisions: declarations of war, the choosing of new elders, matters of life and death. Today they were here to discuss a human. 12 dragons sat in a circle, each one ancient beyond measure. Their scales showed the pale coloring of age, and their eyes held the weight of centuries. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had watched younger species stumble through the cosmos, making the same mistakes over and over. And now one of those younger species stood in their chamber, barely tall enough to reach the knee joint of the smallest dragon present. Jake Morrison looked ridiculous in his patched thermal suit, surrounded by beings that made him look like a child's toy. His helmet was cracked. His gloves were torn and badly repaired. He'd lost his left boot somewhere on the climb and had wrapped his foot in strips of emergency blanket. He was shivering despite the suit's heating elements, and he probably hadn't slept in days. But he stood straight and met their stares without flinching. "This is madness," rumbled Vorthax, one of the senior warriors. His voice was like rocks grinding together. "A human? Offering to help us? Our young are gone, Elder Karosthal. What could this creature possibly do? Wave his tiny hands and make miracles?" Several council members huffed in agreement, small puffs of frost forming in the cold air. They had already mourned. They had already accepted the loss. Bringing in this outsider felt like opening a wound that had just begun to scar over. But Karosthal had seen something when she met the human on the mountainside. She'd looked into his eyes expecting fear. Most species showed fear when facing a Valdren for the first time. Instead, she'd seen something else. Sadness. Deep, genuine sadness. Not for himself or his situation, but for them. For their loss. As if children he'd never met, of a species he'd probably never even heard of before today, mattered to him personally. "Let him speak," Karosthal said quietly. "We have nothing left to lose." Jake had asked to see the rookery first. They'd taken him there under guard, watching as he approached the frozen eggs with something close to reverence. He pulled out a small medical scanner from his emergency kit and moved from nest to nest, checking readings that the dragons couldn't interpret. His hands were gentle, treating each egg as if it were made of glass. Some of the mothers had to look away. It hurt too much to watch. Now, standing before the council, Jake pulled up a holographic display from his battered scanner. The images flickered and jumped, but they held. "Your eggs aren't entirely lost," he said. His voice was steady despite his exhaustion. The cold stopped their development, but it also preserved them. It's like they hit pause instead of stop. In human medicine we have something called cryorecovery. We use it when infants are born too early or when there's trauma. We've saved babies that everyone said were gone. "These are not human children," another council member said coldly. "Our biology is nothing like yours." "Life is life," Jake replied. "The basic principles are the same. I've got equipment in my crashed ship. Medical stasis units, thermal regulators, neural stimulation devices. They're designed to be adaptable for non-human patients. I've used them on 3 different species. With your permission, I think I can stabilize the embryos and restart their development cycles." The chamber fell silent except for the whistle of wind through the crystal formations. The dragons looked at each other, having silent conversations through glances and small gestures that Jake couldn't interpret. "You speak of chances," Karosthal said finally. "What are they? How many might survive?" Jake didn't lie to them. "I don't know. Maybe none. Maybe all. Maybe somewhere in between. But right now they have 0 chance. Any chance is better than that." "This could be a trick," Vorthax growled. "Humans are known for their deceptions. Perhaps he wants access to our technology. Our knowledge." Jake actually laughed at that, a tired sound that echoed strangely in the vast chamber. "Look at me. Really look at me. I'm half frozen, my ship is scrap, and I'm standing in front of 12 beings who could turn me into paste without trying hard. If I wanted to steal from you, this would be the worst plan in history. Then why?" Karosthal moved closer, lowering her massive head until her eye was level with Jake's face. "Why would you do this? We are nothing to your kind. We have refused every offer of contact, every attempt at friendship. We have made it clear we want nothing from the galaxy. Why would you risk your life for our children?" Jake was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "Because I'm a doctor. I took an oath a long time ago. It doesn't matter if my patient has 2 legs or 4 or wings. It doesn't matter if they're human or dragon or something else entirely. When someone needs help, I help. That's who I am. He paused, then continued. And because no parent, no matter what species, should have to bury their children if there's any chance at all. I've lost patience before. I know what it feels like to tell someone their kid didn't make it. If I can prevent that even once, even for strangers, I have to try. The council deliberated for what felt like hours. They argued in their ancient language, voices rising and falling. Finally, Karwasisthal turned back to Jake. 3 days, she said. We will give you 3 days to show us this miracle of yours. If you fail, we will honor the attempt. If you succeed. She paused as if the possibility was too strange to voice. If you succeed, the Valdren will owe humanity a debt we cannot repay. Jake nodded. I don't want a debt. I just want to save your kids. Jake didn't sleep that first night. Or the second. Or the third. He couldn't afford to. Every hour that passed was another hour those embryos spent frozen in limbo, another hour closer to the point where no technology in the universe could bring them back. The trip down to his crashed ship was brutal. The storm had picked up again, not as bad as before but enough to make the descent dangerous. Jake slipped twice, nearly broke his ankle on hidden rocks, and arrived at the wreckage feeling like he'd been beaten with clubs. But he loaded up every piece of medical equipment he could carry and made the climb back up. The Valdren guards who watched him seemed almost impressed by his stubbornness. Setting up in the rookery was like trying to perform surgery in a freezer. Jake's fingers were numb even through his gloves. His breath formed ice crystals that kept getting in his way. The medical equipment wasn't designed for these temperatures, so he had to improvise, wrapping heating elements around sensitive components and praying they'd hold together long enough to do some good. The Valdren healers came to watch. They were old dragons, some even older than Karwasisthal, with knowledge passed down through countless generations. They knew dragon anatomy better than anyone in the galaxy. But they'd never seen anything like what Jake was doing. He explained everything as he worked, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. This is a neural stimulator. It sends tiny electrical pulses to jumpstart dormant brain activity. And this, he held up a clear tube filled with glowing blue fluid, this is a synthetic amniotic solution. It'll provide nutrients and maintain the right chemical balance while we bring their core temperature up slowly. Too fast and we'll damage the tissue. Too slow and we'll run out of time. One of the healers, an ancient female named HFY, moved closer. In all my centuries I have never seen such devices. Your people are resourceful. We have to be, Jake said, carefully placing thermal regulators around the first egg. We're fragile compared to most species. We break easy, we get sick easy, we die easy. So we learn to be creative. We learn to refuse to accept no for an answer. But the science was only part of it. What really caught the Valdren off guard was what Jake did between the technical procedures. He talked to the eggs. Not like a doctor running through medical jargon, but like a person speaking to someone who mattered. He'd pull up a small stool next to an egg, adjust the equipment, and then just sit there for a moment with his hand on the shell. Hey there, little one, he'd say softly. I know you've had a rough time. But we're working on it, okay? We're going to get you through this. Then he'd tell stories. Stories about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests. About human children playing in snow, building snowmen and having snowball fights, laughing in the cold that would kill them if they stayed out too long. He told them about spring, about how winter always feels like it'll last forever but it never does. About flowers pushing up through frozen ground because life always finds a way. The Valdren who gathered to watch didn't understand it at first. This was medical treatment. Why was the human telling stories to creatures that couldn't possibly hear him? But they kept watching, kept listening, and slowly they began to understand. This wasn't just about science. This was about hope. About treating these eggs not as medical cases but as people. As children who deserved to be welcomed into the world with warmth and care. A young warrior named Draxer approached on the second day. He was barely a century old, young by Valdren standards, and he'd been watching Jake with intense curiosity. Your people are so small, he said quietly. You live such brief lives. By the time a Valdren reaches adulthood, an entire generation of humans has come and gone. Yet you fight for every moment like it's precious. Jake smiled without looking up from the thermal regulator he was adjusting. The egg in front of him was showing the faintest signs of life, tiny fluctuations in temperature that suggested a heartbeat trying to restart. Maybe that's exactly why, he said. We don't have time to waste on giving up. Every moment matters when you only get a handful of them. By the third day, 6 eggs were showing strong life signs. Real, measurable heartbeats. neural activity that suggested developing consciousness. The Valdrin mothers who'd given up hope began to hover nearby, afraid to believe but unable to stay away. Jake barely noticed. He was running on stimulants from his emergency kit and pure determination. His hands shook from exhaustion, but they stayed steady when it mattered. HFY and the other healers had stopped just watching. They were helping now, following Jake's instructions, learning techniques that seemed impossible but clearly worked. How did you learn this? HFY asked as they worked together on the seventh egg. This cannot be standard training for your medics. It's not, Jake admitted. I worked in the frontier colonies for 8 years. Out there you don't have fancy hospitals or specialist equipment. You learn to make do with what you have. You learn that improvising and refusing to quit saves more lives than all the fancy degrees in the universe. By the 5th day 12 eggs were stable. By the end of the week 23 showed strong signs of life. 23 embryos that had been as good as dead were now developing normally, their tiny hearts beating in rhythm that brought tears to eyes that hadn't cried in centuries. The impossible had become possible, not through some miracle of technology, but through human stubbornness and the simple refusal to accept that some lives couldn't be saved. Jake finally collapsed on the 8th day, his body giving out mid-adjustment on the 24th egg. The Valdrin caught him before he hit the ground, carried him to a warm chamber, and stood guard while he slept for 16 hours straight. When he woke up, the first thing he asked was whether the eggs were still stable. They were. All 23 of them. Growing stronger every hour. The sound started as a tiny crack, so small that Jake almost missed it over the hum of the medical equipment. He was on his 14th hour of monitoring the eggs that day, checking readouts and adjusting thermal levels. His eyes were burning from lack of sleep, and his hands had developed a permanent tremor from exhaustion. But when he heard that crack, everything else disappeared. He dropped to his knees beside the egg, hardly daring to breathe. Another crack. Then another. A small piece of shell fell away, revealing something pale and wet underneath. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he watched a tiny snout push through the opening. The little dragon struggled, working instinctively to break free from the shell that had been its world. "Come on," Jake whispered. "You can do it. Just a little more." The egg split wider and suddenly there it was, a small, perfect white dragon no bigger than a house cat. Its scales were soft and translucent, still wet from the egg. Its eyes opened, deep blue and unfocused, seeing the world for the first time. It opened its mouth and let out a sound somewhere between a chirp and a mew, high-pitched and confused and absolutely wonderfully alive. Jake realized he was crying. He didn't care. He'd seen a lot of births in his years as a medic, but this was different. This was a life that shouldn't exist. A child that every expert would have pronounced dead. And here it was, breathing and moving and calling for its mother. The rookery exploded into chaos. The mother dragon, who'd been watching from a distance with barely contained hope, rushed forward. Other Valdrins swarmed in, their massive forms surrounding the nest. But they were gentle, so careful not to hurt the tiny hatchling or the exhausted human who'd made this miracle possible. More cracks echoed through the rookery. A second egg. A third. A fourth. All across the nesting grounds, the eggs Jake had stabilized were hatching. The air filled with the mewing cries of newborn dragons and the deep, rumbling sounds of joy from their parents. Dragons who'd been preparing to mourn for centuries were suddenly surrounded by new life. Elder Caristhal made her way through the crowd to where Jake still knelt beside that first hatchling. The little dragon had found its mother and was already attempting to nurse, making contented sounds that no one in the colony thought they'd ever hear again. Jake was slumped against the side of the nest, his body finally giving out now that the crisis was over. 23, Caristhal said softly, her ancient voice thick with emotion. 23 lives you have given back to us. Jake managed a tired smile. 23 who fought their way back. I just gave them the chance. His vision was going gray at the edges. He felt strong but gentle claws catch him as he toppled sideways, lowering him carefully to the ground. Young dragons surrounded him, these warriors who'd watched him work for days without rest. They looked at him with something Jake had never expected to see in the eyes of beings so powerful. Wonder. Pure, undiluted wonder. The storm broke that afternoon. After weeks of violence, the electromagnetic maelstrom finally spent its fury and moved on. The clouds parted, revealing a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Sunlight streamed into the rookery, warming the stones and the hatchlings who chirped and played under the watchful eyes of parents who couldn't stop touching them, as if afraid they might disappear. Jake woke up in a warm chamber, his body wrapped in thermal blankets that the Valdrin had woven from some kind of crystalline fiber. Every muscle ached, but it was the good kind of ache. The kind that came from hard work that mattered. He made his way outside slowly, his frost-damaged foot wrapped in proper bandages that HFY Story had insisted on applying personally. The rescue ship appeared over the mountains 3 days later, responding to Jake's emergency beacon that had finally gotten through once the storm cleared. Jake stood on the main crystalline platform, his few belongings packed, watching the ship descend. Part of him didn't want to leave. He'd grown attached to this place, to these people, to the little dragons who were already showing distinct personalities. HFY approached him one final time. The ancient dragon moved slowly with a weight that seemed more than physical. She lowered her massive head until her eye was level with Jake's face, close enough that he could see his own reflection in that deep, ancient gaze. "We were wrong," she said simply. The words seemed to cost her something, but she spoke them clearly. "For centuries we believed that isolation made us strong. That needing no one was the same as being powerful. We looked down on younger species, on their alliances and their connections. We thought we were better because we stood alone." She paused, and Jake saw something shine in her eye that might have been a tear. "But we see now what real strength looks like. It looks like a stranger crossing a storm to help people he's never met. It looks like refusing to give up when everyone else has accepted defeat. It looks like you, Jake Morrison." Jake reached out and touched the dragon's snout gently, his small hand barely covering a fraction of the scale. "Strength is also knowing when to accept help. When to let others in. You did that. You trusted me when you had no reason to. That took courage too." The rescue ship landed, and Jake's crew rushed out, exclaiming over his condition and the dragons surrounding them. But before Jake could board, HFY spoke again. "The Valdren are opening our skies," she announced. "We will join the Galactic Union. But we have one condition, that humanity be recognized as a species of exceptional worth. When they ask us why, we will tell them about the human who arrived through the storm. The human who taught an ancient race that sometimes the smallest among the stars burns the brightest." Jake boarded the ship with a final wave. As it lifted off, he looked down at the rookery where 23 little white dragons played in the sunlight. They would grow up knowing about the human who refused to let them die. They would become the first Valdren ambassadors to human space, calling themselves the Storm Clutch in honor of the storm that brought them their unlikely savior. And they would carry a lesson that would spread across the galaxy, that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their weapons or their technology. It was their stubborn, foolish, beautiful refusal to abandon hope, even for strangers.